All right, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a wonderful lunch if it's that time of day for you, or maybe second breakfast, or early dinner, or time zones. I don't know. Anyway, I hope you had a refreshing break, and we're back with more talks for you. So, the ultimate goal of any software product is to offer a great user experience, right, to its users. And user interfaces and workflows must be clear, they need to be self explanatory, and they need to be appealing. And software documentation shouldn't be any different in that regard either, right? So comprehensive diagrams that visualize ideas and concept have a big part to play there. Good thing we have Simon Lasselsberger joining us, who helps software companies design scalable software systems. And with his consulting company Lassim, which has three S's. So I don't know if I should say like a last. Do we need to stretch the S? Maybe.
It's fine.
Uh, so you support developers and decision makers with solving architectural challenges, mentoring, and coaching. And you started your professional life actually in chip design, which I hope we get a lot of questions from the audience if they don't have questions about the topic at hand. But you've always loved software more. So without further ado, please, the stage is yours. Whenever you are ready, start.
Perfect. Thank you for the introduction. So, yeah, software architecture diagrams and how to use them efficiently to communicate. I'm sure you all have been in the situation where you knew the solution to a problem, but you had to convince others that the solution was actually a good one. I certainly was in this situation when I started working at Rentastic or worked for them for some time. It is an Austrian startup that was quite famous and successful. So we also had a lot of scaling issues, and we were using Ruby on Rails on the backend side, and we had to do something about that. And I was convinced that microservices were a good idea to solve our issues or to address them at least. But I had to convince the founders to actually invest into this change of architecture. And to convince them, I started drawing diagrams to explain on a high level what we wanted to do. And these diagrams helped a lot to actually communicate this. Without them, I think I wouldn't have managed to do that. And we further used these diagrams to not only scale our system, but we also scaled our development process using them because we could align our agile teams on certain aspects of the architecture that were really important for us and make them understand what we actually wanted to do. And now, in my current profession, as a software architecture and development consultant, I also use these diagrams on a daily basis. But why do these diagrams work so well? Well, in software, we usually work in teams because the problems that we solve are bigger, way bigger than what just one person or one team could actually solve. But working together means also we need to align ourselves on a common goal. We need to work together. And for that, we need to communicate. And there is the Austrian communication scientist Paul Watzlawick who once said, one cannot not communicate. What he means is we cannot escape communication. It's always there, even if we are not communicating on a fact or fact basis level or on, on an information level. We still communicate on a relationship level. And Gerald Weinberg, another very famous guy from the software industry, said, no matter how it looks at first, it's always a people problem. And what he means is that whatever problem that we have, it's always a problem between people, and people need to communicate. And when this communication is bad, unclear, or ambiguous, then we can very easily run into problems. And just by showing you this picture, I cannot know what you saw first, the rabbit or the duck. Or let's try a different experiment. I will verbally explain a software architecture of a small system to you, and then we will see if we have the same understanding of the system. So the system is a small application for a web shop. Users can access the web shop via a mobile application and a web application. And those two applications are connected to the backend via an API gateway. And inside the backend, we have a user service, a dedicated user service with a dedicated database. And we have an old monolithic application that takes care of shipping, inventory, and other stuff, but they share a common database, a shared database. We also have an analytics component in the backend. And this analytics component is responsible for creating reports and exporting data into an external ERP system. And to do asynchronous communication within the system, we also have a message bus. So I'm wondering, what image, what picture do you have in your head? Is it the same one that I have? This one? Because if we had this picture, while I was explaining it to you, I think we would have created a better and more common understanding of the whole system. And this is why it is so important to use pictorial content with explaining architectural stuff or any stuff, especially. And there is also scientific proof to that. Scientists wrote in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in March 1998, a striking characteristic of human memory is that pictures are remembered better than words. From an evolutionary perspective, the ability to remember various aspects of one's visual environment must be vital for survival. So it is not surprising that memory for pictorial material is particularly well developed. So you experienced this yourself, right? Can you recall the quote from Gerald Weinberg? Like, whatever they tell you, it's always a people problem? Or was it easier for you to recall if the boat on the first slide was going on a lake or on an ocean? I mean, it was the ocean. Or take a look at your social media feeds or your favorite news sites. What is the stuff that you first look at? What can you grasp the quickest? It's always charts, pictures, images, and videos. Everything that is pictorial content. Text is way harder to process for the brain, and we just really don't like reading a lot. So it's clear that on the consuming side, pictures and pictorial content in general is easy to remember, easy to understand. But on a producing side, it seems different, right? It can be really easy, or it seems rather easy to hammer out paragraph after paragraph without thinking too much of a storyline, just to get some kind of documentation done. But this should not be our goal, because there is no value in paragraphs that are written but never read. So it is just basically a waste of time. So we at least need to make sure that the storyline of our texts are great, but it's way better to produce pictorial content. And like a teacher of mine or a professor of mine once said, a battered book is a good book because it indicates that it is used a lot. And I mean, digital content doesn't wear out when it's used, but you get the idea. We need to produce content that is actually useful and used, because otherwise we are just wasting everybody's time. And to do that, we need to also keep our audience in our mind. Just like we do in software, we always build software around problems that our users have. And we should do the same thing with our software documentation, basically, and also with our software architecture diagrams that we're talking about today. So we need to understand who our audience is. And for the sake of this presentation today, I will focus on one audience. And this is project and product managers and software developers, and the gap that they have right in between them. So we need to bring them closer together, and we can leverage software architecture diagrams to do that. Because when we bring them closer together, build a better common understanding between those two areas, we can already solve a lot of issues that software development teams have in general. And project and product managers have a better way of understanding what software developers talk about when they have a picture that or kind of a playing ground where they can see what they're actually talking about. And software developers have a tool to express themselves, and together they can communicate and shape the whole system way better, the whole product. So this is the audience we're going to focus today. Of course, there can be many other audiences, but always keep in mind, think of your audience before you start drawing some diagrams. And the next thing, let's take a look at the diagrams that we have at hand to describe software. Obviously, UML is one of the biggest fish in the pond. And There is also a lot of controversy in the industry if UML is actually useful. I think it is, but I also like the saying that one of the authors of UML did. He said, you probably only need 20% of UML to describe 80% of your software. And I think that that is true. I personally like and see a lot of value in class diagrams and also in state and sequence diagrams. I mean, you could have done a similar diagram like I showed you a few slides ago with the component diagrams of UML, but I lack a lot of flexibility here. So I use class diagrams, state diagrams, and sequence diagrams a lot. But that's just a side note. We can also do a Google search for software architecture diagram, and what we see is that they all look different because there is no industry standard, actually. I mean, but they have stuff in common. They all have boxes. They sometimes have a user or some kind of actor, and they have lines connecting the actor and the boxes, describing some kind of relationship. So basically, they are block diagrams. And we are also going to draw some block diagrams, or I will show you some block diagrams today. And I need to mention another very famous and very useful model to do software architecture diagrams, and that is the C4 model that was created by Simon Brown when he also was not happy with the fact that there is no standard for software architecture diagrams. It's called C4 because it defines 4 levels: the context, containers, components, and code level. And you build one model, basically, that's the idea, and then you render different diagrams out of it to tell different stories. And he also gives you a lot of hints on how to do that well. And there is a lot of tooling around this. So keeping everything of that, all of that in mind, these are basically the 5 goals that I have when I draw software architecture diagrams. First of all, I want them to be easy to read, so our audience should be able to understand the diagram within seconds. They should be standalone, and major parts should make sense without having additional explanation. They need to be fast to create, so it shouldn't take us too much time to create them. They need to be easy to maintain. So things change all the time, that's for sure. But we should be able to adopt our diagrams really quickly. And one of the most important things, it's the last goal, but I think it's really important, that we should take an effort and make them beautiful. And I will show you today how to do that quickly. Because I think diagrams act as marketing material for technical ideas. And for that reason, I think they should look decent. So over the years, I collected a lot of guidelines, and I compiled it down to rather 12 guidelines. It looks like a lot, but they are really easy. Like the first one is have a title. So it defines the focus of your diagram, and it gives your audience a context. And I like to put it on the top left corner. The next guideline is not too easy. We need to find the correct abstraction layer, and that really depends on our audience, on the story that we want to tell. But in general, for the audience that I defined before, the C4 level 2, the containers level, is a pretty good trade-off between detail and the opportunity to keep it stable and unchanged for a longer time. And also, it's a great playing ground for the audience that I defined before. But there is another rule of thumb that I use, and I I think we should just keep it down to the essentials. So think of it like you only have a napkin to draw on. And there is also some kind of story that I think of sometimes is, imagine you're in a bar in a loud environment and you're having drinks with a friend, and you talk about work. That's what we do sometimes, right? And you explain your current project or your current idea or something like that, and you only have a napkin to draw on. So you have a lot of distraction, and this is also true for work, right? You have a lot of distraction around, and you need to boil it down to the essentials. And you're also drawing for a friend, so you know the context, you know what your friend knows about, and you can tailor the diagram directly to your audience. And this is what what they also kind of use as a rule of thumb or some kind of helper. The next few slides cover something where I say for these diagrams, these structural diagrams, I only want to show structure. So at the abstraction level that we're focusing on, we only can show the structure of our system. We should not show behavior in these diagrams. This is maybe not obvious in the beginning, but if you think about it, a structural diagram does not have a notion of time. And to describe behavior, we need some kind of notion of time. We cannot just describe behavior without it. So think of it like this. We are creating the playing board for a board game, not the rule book. If we're talking about behavior, which is obviously very important because it's mostly the reason why we're building our product, we should use additional diagrams like the sequence diagram that you see on the right side to describe behavior. And this is where I think UML comes in really handy. The next thing that kind of sneaks in sometimes in the structural diagrams is infrastructure information. Again, infrastructure is really important, but imagine the system that I showed on the right side of the slide with these 3 hexagons. The infrastructure looks totally different if we deploy it on a single server or on a hybrid cloud system. So, but the structure of the system stays the same. So this is something that needs additional documentation, and it also, again, like I said, it benefits from pictorial content. So do this separately and don't mix it with your structural diagram. And the last thing that I like to avoid, and this is rather easy or something that we fall into in this trap, that we fall into this easily, is to add technology icons because they look great. But I think they really, they are distracting. Because if I showed you this diagram sooner, I think the first thing that you would have looked at were the icons and not the actual structure of the system. So again, technologies choices are important, but they should be documented at some other level or a deeper level of the documentation, not on the overall structure. Of course, there could be stories that you wanted to tell to migrate from one technology to another, then it would make sense, but don't use it as a default. Rather, keep it out. Also, when you're in a bar, would you start drawing icons? I don't think so. So the next one is again an easy one. I like to use a left to right direction. I like to put the user, the most important thing, on the left side, and then kind of go with the flow of the story that I want to tell from left to right to the lesser important parts of the story. I like to use a consistent set of symbols. I personally find the hexagons really visually appealing because you can also draw these nice clusters. But I like to keep a small set in general of shapes that I use. On the right side, you basically see all the shapes that I use most of the time. And avoid using different sizes of the shapes. If you really need to use different sizes, you need to explain it. And that could also be distracting. Sorry. Where could you describe such things in the legend? There you should explain the symbols, the shapes, the colors, the connectors, the meaning of arrowheads, and the meaning of the proximity of shapes. And on the right side, you can see an example of such a legend. I refer to color coding. Color coding is great because you can visualize information using colors, but use a set of colors, use a color palette that works well together. There are tons of websites out there where you can get your color palette, but you can also just go to my website that I will show you in the end, where you can use my color palette and even use all of my shapes and some other additional libraries for diagrams.net. So, as I said, use a set of colors that work well together. You need to explain the color code in the legend, and be careful. I think you can only have 2 domains where you can use color coding without any worries, and that is the fill color of the shapes and the line color of the connections. I like to avoid using color coding for the borders of the shapes because it can get really distracting. But I will show you an example later where I still use color coding for the border. So you see, these are guidelines. These are not strict rules, but do what helps to tell the story. What is really important, though, is to label every node, and you should not use abbreviations that get unclear. So when you use abbreviations, it should be clear for everybody in your audience what you mean. Don't just make up abbreviations. Rather, opt for a smaller font size to fit the real name in. But don't create some kind of abbreviation that is unclear to your audience. Connections are a rather tricky thing. Together with the placement of the nodes, this is something where you can, or where it is worth investing the most time when creating a diagram, because besides using the orthogonal style that I like to use, because I think you end up with a very tidy diagram in the end. You need to try to avoid crossing connections, because crossing connections are always very hard to understand, and parallel connections are even worse. Like you can see on the right side, this is kind of a bad example, like you can see. And you need to ask yourself, is showing all the connections really necessary, or can you leave them out? Because if you have too many connections, or in general, too much information in one diagram, then you're effectively hiding information because nobody can understand it anymore. Remember the first rule or the first goal that I have? The audience must be able to understand the diagram within seconds. And I don't think that the example on the right side is easy to understand. And you also need to explain what connections really mean. You can use the legend for that. And I only add additional explanations, meaning labels on edges or connections, for special or otherwise unclear connections, so that I can support the story with the label. Arrowheads are also one kind of tricky thing, because arrowheads kind of are one way where behavior can sneak into your structural diagrams, but you can still use arrowheads, although I like to leave them out entirely, for something like a one-way road. Remember, we are creating the playing board or the map of the system, and you can use an arrowhead to indicate that this is a one-way road. Like you see here, the analytics service exports data to the ERP system. There is no way data goes back. And only add arrowheads at one end of a connection. If you really need 2 arrowheads, then draw 2 arrows. Then we're diving a little bit into the guidelines for making it a little bit more visually appealing and more beautiful. So I like to use consistent spacing, vertically and horizontally, and I like to use the same space, and I like to align everything on a grid. And you can also play around with the proximity of your shapes. Especially with these hexagons, you're able to build these clusters. Like I said before in the introduction, when I explained the shop architecture to you, I said there is an old monolithic application, and I like to use these clusters touching hexagons to indicate that this component consists of multiple modules, but everything is deployed in a single artifact, like in this case, an old monolithic application. But you need to explain that in the legend as well. Don't use more than 2 fonts, and not more than 3 different font sizes, and try to blend in with the documentation that uses your diagram. It's just just look it up, what fonts are used, and then also use it in your diagrams. And the last guideline, and then I'm through with my guidelines, is called what I call design it. So like I said, diagrams are technically marketing material. And for that, we can also kind of get some inspiration from graphics design. Like Antoine de Saint-Exupéry said, perfection is achieved not when there is nothing more to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. And Dieter Rams said something rather similar. He said, it is about subtracting the non-essentials, making your design practical yet pure. I mean, we cannot build really abstract things like they can do in graphics design. We still need to make sure that our diagrams are technically correct. But we can keep this in mind because there are brilliant minds in graphics design that know how to design things, and we can get inspiration from them. So rather leave stuff out that is not essential rather than packing everything together. I think this is way more valuable. And take your time. This is maybe something that is really the most important thing. Take your time to make your diagrams beautiful. Because your audience will totally understand and be happy with it, with these diagrams when they're beautiful and to the point. So before I close, I'd like to show you 3 examples where out of my work. So this is for example a blog post from Code Car. I took the liberty to take this diagram from there, where he wrote a blog post to describe how he thinks the Twitter system design looks like. And it is a really great blog post, and it features this diagram. And I tried to redo it in the way I would have done it. I'm not saying it's bad. I would just say I would have done it differently, because everything is very well explained in the blog post. So when I take everything that he had into the way I would have done it, it would look like this. But you see, there is still stuff that needs to be improved by the guidelines that I just showed you. The first thing that I would do is decrease the amount of connections that are necessary to tell the story. It already got a little bit better, but I think in the next step I would remove even more. But what I did is, you see at the bottom right corner of the dashed box, I added a note that says only important connections are shown, just to give the audience an indication that there is more connections than are shown here. But for the story of the blog post, this is sufficient. I would even leave out the connections between the API gateways and the connection and the services themselves. And the top right corner is still something that I'm not too happy with. I think it kind of violates my guideline for the abstraction layer. So I kind of compressed and combined services into a small amount of services. And then this is what I would have ended up with to tell the same story as was shown in the blog post. The next example is something out of my real work that I did with a client, where we needed to extract a framework out of an existing microservices architecture to be able to deploy the whole system to multiple instances for their customers. And to do that, I created this animation, because with this animation, I had the possibility to show even more than just with a static diagram. So you see, I flipped the whole architecture back, showed the extraction of the framework, then displayed the connection, and then I used the borders of the hexagons to indicate that the framework was used for these services. So there you see, we can it's all about using pictorial content. In this case, it was an animation to even further tell the story visually. And I said before that we can only show structure with the structural diagrams. That is right. But when we add the notion of time in the form of an animation, then we can also display behavior on top of this diagram. And there you see, this is not out of a real use case. This is just a joke that I did once for Christmas, where I tried to answer the question, Daddy, how do the presents end up under the Christmas tree? And you will see the kids writing letters to the Christkind, and the Christkind has an app to digitalize the letters and then send it to the backend. So take a look at this. With this approach, you can add a notion of time to your diagrams. And there you see messages flowing around the bus, services picking it up, doing some kind of wish recognition. Gift production happens, and then finally the wrapping service can pick it up, wrap everything in a nice package, and then deliver it to the Christmas tree, and everybody's happy. So with that approach, you can do it, and I'm working currently also on a plugin for diagrams.net that you can use to do that. To wrap this up, Simon Sinek once said, 100% of employees are people, and 100% of customers are people, and 100% of investors are people. And if you don't understand people, you don't understand business. And another Simon said, 100% of your colleagues are people, and 100% of your stakeholders are people. And if you don't care about your audience, you don't understand communication. So a picture says it's worth 1,000 words. And these diagrams are our direct connection into the perception of our audience. We take a lot of effort to make our software products about our users, about the problems of our users. And I think we should do the same thing for our users, the users of our documentation, our colleagues, our stakeholders, by creating beautiful diagrams. And if it takes them only seconds to understand your diagram, I think your time creating it was very well spent. And I also hope your time was well spent in my talk. And if you want to know more about my work and about diagrams, then please visit my website, lassim.com with 3 S's /diagrams, or follow me on LinkedIn, Twitter, or Facebook. Yeah, I'm happy to connect with you and get your feedback.
Awesome. Thank you for that talk. So many wise Simons, can't keep count. Also, I really enjoyed Santa's cloud transformation that you showed there. That was wonderful. I do think we have questions from the audience, so let's switch to that real quick. Right. So the question is, can you tell us something about tooling? What do you think about planned UML or creating diagrams using Python diagrams library?
Yeah, totally. I love diagrams as code. I use, whenever I do UML stuff, I use plant UML. I think it's really useful. But there's also nothing wrong with Mermaid or any other approach. It's really great. What I personally use a lot for the structural diagrams is, as I said, diagrams.net, because, as I said, I like to make them beautiful, and I need a way to kind of place stuff and play around with things. And this is harder with diagrams as code, because there you usually get this automatically generated visual representation of your code, and this is not too easy to really influence that. I'm not saying they are bad, but they don't give me the flexibility most of the time.
Yeah, I've also certainly seen cases where people use the dot language to create something quickly first, and then iterate over it to make it, as you said, more beautiful. While we stay on the topic of beautiful, I wondered if you have something to say about accessibility. You mentioned the color palette. Do you also check that those colors are distinctive enough so that people that would have color blindness don't get confused?
Yeah, I got that question before. That's actually something that I did not take into account at the beginning, but I'm now aware of that. But it's again something that I mentioned already. Take care of your audience, right? If they have this condition, then you also need to take that into account, basically, right? So make sure that you find a way to make the diagrams in the way that they can read them quickly and understand them.
Yeah. So quick tip: don't rely on color, because that color is a very difficult thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I say this as a former graphics designer. Also, don't only learn from graphics designers, hire them too. They need jobs too. See if we have another question. Thanks for the presentation. So that's nice to hear. Right. So more tool question: which ones you use mostly, but to animate, also to do the animation. So specifically,
Yeah,
animation.
for the animations, this is where I'm not too happy with what the tooling is available.
Mm.
The first animation where I flipped showed the extraction of the framework. This was done by hand using image magic, where I have a blog post on my blog, or where I show this the whole process. But it's basically doing Ruby scripting and using image magic to do all the transformations and stuff. But for the Christmas animation, as I said, I have a working prototype ready for a diagrams.net plugin where you can draw all these paths where the images or the icons go, and I'm planning to release it as soon as possible. But follow me, and then
And you'll
you will
release
know.
it as open source, right?
Yeah, sure.
Perfect. So, would you be looking for contributions then too, once you did?
Yes, totally. If somebody's interested to help me out here, I'm totally open for that.
Awesome. So that's a call to action for everyone that's listening and is interested in diagram animations. Thank you so much, Simon. We're out of questions, but thank you for this talk. Excellent tips and tricks. I wrote a lot of stuff down. And remember, this is my field of expertise, so go figure. Thanks again, and have a wonderful day. I hope you join us in the chat and join us for the next couple of talks.
Yeah, totally. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Bye.
This is all we got. Dreaming about a revolution in our minds. This is all we got.
Lock me out of this life institution. I am angry and I on illusions. Yes, I hate, but it's not a solution. Try my best, buddy, I'm just a human. Oh, we don't need to say we're sorry. We don't need to worship heaven's stars. We don't need to say we're sorry. So where's the love?
This is all we got. Dreaming about a revolution in our minds. This is all we got. Talking about resolutions, getting high. We don't need a lot, and we don't care if we fuck it up. If it's what we got, then why not give it all we got?
I can see in your eyes you're defeated. Try to fool yourself till you believe it. That you